Hi everyone, good evening, welcome. I'm so glad that you're all here. I am Pam Franks. I am the class of 1956 director of the Williams College Museum of Art, and it has been an incredible privilege for us this semester to have the exhibition Michael Rakowitz, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist. And it has been wonderful to have Michael Rakowitz with us for the last couple of days. Thank you so much for the exhibition and for being here. I'm really just here to say welcome and hello. I do want to extend an extra special thanks to alumnus of the grad program, Tom Beischer, for supporting this evening's program. Michael Rakowitz's good friend, Tom Beischer, is the supporter of this evening's program, and we wanted to surprise you with that. So that's good news too. And I also want to extend a very, very special thanks to my colleague Lisa Doran, Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Contemporary Art, who is the curator of this exhibition and who has written a really terrific essay that you'll find in this brochure. And I encourage you all to pick it up and have a good close read if you haven't yet. And with that, I'm really going to pass it over to Lisa to talk about this evening's panel and frame the issues and introduce the panelists. So good to see you all.
Thank you. And I'm just going to join Pam in welcoming everyone to the panel tonight. Thank you all for being here. And I also want to thank my colleagues Nina Pelez, Curator of Programs and Interpretation, and Ann Kennedy, our Program and Events Coordinator for tonight's event. So thank you so much for that. We're going to end just shy of 7:30 for those who are planning to attend the Marvin Toure lecture over at L231. So that is our aim, but we might be rubbing just up against it, so just so you know. So when the Reverend Dwight Whitney Marsh, Williams class of 1842, gifted the Neo-Assyrian reliefs to the college, he did so with the following intention, quote, "My great desire and prayer is that students who look upon the relics of the past may think wisely of time. Would that every active imagination hear the stones cry out, Asia has claims upon New England. When the young American beholds them, may they remember that God is older than the ages," end quote. Marsh's pedagogical aims were deeply intertwined with his Christian missionary goals. Over the last 168 years that the Neo-Assyrian reliefs have been at Williams College, their presence here has been variously celebrated, critiqued, and even ignored or nearly forgotten. By inviting artist Michael Rakowitz to present his work here, we aim to engage the ancient reliefs in our collection in a contemporary dialogue. We do so not with Marsh's religious motivations, but rather with criticality about their presence here, notions of ethics, social justice, responsibility, and care. With these values in mind, we have assembled here tonight an interdisciplinary group of thinkers, scholars, makers, and teachers who, through their respective positions, will help us consider these ancient reliefs as live, relevant, and resonant objects in the present. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists. Alison Gruseke is a scholar of the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible and currently a visiting instructor at Yale Divinity School. Her research interests encompass the Old Testament in its ancient Near East context, the formation of ancient identities, and the reception of the ancient world in modern contexts, including the contemporary classroom. She has taught several winter study courses titled Game of Thrones, circa 850 BCE, about the Williams College Museum of Art's Neo-Assyrian reliefs, contextualizing them within an understanding of the politics, religion, gender dynamics, and culture of the Neo-Assyrian period. Kirsten Scheid is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the American University of Beirut, where she studies imagination technologies, artistic materialities, and social change, specifically through cases of modern and contemporary Arab art. She has co-curated numerous international exhibitions and consulted for museums in London and New York. She is currently the Clark Oakley Humanities Fellow at the Clark Art Institute and Williams College, where she's completing an historically informed ethnography of aesthetic encounters that comprise contemporary Palestine. This past Tuesday night, she delivered her talk, Curating Jerusalem, Actual and Possible, Political Lessons from a Non-Euclidean City, which luckily freed her up to participate in our panel tonight. Michael Rakowitz is an internationally recognized site-specific and conceptual artist based in Chicago, where he also teaches at Northwestern University. His exhibition history and list of awards and recognitions is a bit too great to share here tonight, but he's currently the subject of a major survey exhibition at the Castello di Rivoli Museum of Contemporary Art in Turin, which also runs concurrently with Lamassu 2018, Rakowitz's reconstruction of an Assyrian human-headed winged bull out of date syrup cans in London's Trafalgar Square. And this January, Michael will be opening a show at Jane Lombard Gallery in New York City, where he will be showing a section of Room F of the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, which is where one of the reliefs at the Williams College Museum originally resided. And finally, Magnus Bernhardsson is the Brown Professor of History and Faculty Affiliate in Leadership Studies and Religion at Williams College. His research and teaching centers on modern Middle Eastern history, modern Iraq, U.S.-Iraqi relations, nationalism, and the history of archaeology. Magnus has generously agreed to moderate our discussion tonight. The three panelists will each present some brief prepared remarks, and then Magnus will lead a discussion and open the floor up for questions from all of you. So with that, I will turn it over to Alison to get us started.
Hello, everyone. I'm a scholar of the ancient world, and most of us aren't familiar with that. Our knowledge, if we're lucky, we studied classics, maybe we have knowledge of religion and the Bible. But when the earliest explorers were first encountering these artifacts that we're going to look at tonight, they had no context at all. So let's start with where we are. Here's the ancient Near East. You all, I think you had 5th grade history. You know what the Fertile Crescent is. There it is. Dur-Sharrukin is one of the famous capitals made by Sargon II, and just below that is Kala. That's the biblical name for Kalhu, modern Nimrud. That's the city where our reliefs came from. It was a palatial city, probably renovated built around 1200 BCE, and vastly renovated by Ashurnasirpal II around 850 BC. All the dates I speak about are BCE. So here's the mound now. Here's what the ancient site looked like. This is after it's experienced archaeological digging for some time. You can see the ziggurat in the foreground, that's the step temple, and then the palatial expanse is beyond it on the right. It's been described formerly as one of the most beautiful archaeological sites in the Near East, and you can see why. This is in springtime when the color is just starting to turn. But that, of course, is before ISIS. This is Austin Henry Layard. There were early explorers even before the 19th century, but around 1848, he was exploring, had a very small grant to do some excavation, and he started turning up fantastic relics, art as well as cuneiform tablets. Mostly at that time, it was an arms race among the great powers of the old world, France, Germany, and England, for who could amass more of these fantastic treasures, which you'll see in a minute, including our reliefs. But Layard was also interested in the texts. No one knew how to read cuneiform then. It just looked, if you haven't seen it, I used to love it before I knew how to read it. It looks like chickens walking on snow. It's very, very beautiful. And if I had more time, I'd show you different handwriting and the way children's handwriting looked, which is marvelous. This is John Henry Haines, a Williams graduate, who donated the part of our collection that was not given by Haines. He was a photographer, one of the earliest archaeological photographers, and he was in charge of a major dig in the scribal city of Nippur in Babylonia, and he unearthed a trove of 10,000 tablets. But his work was stolen from him by a disreputable competitor of his, and he died of a broken heart in Williamstown. He's buried nearby in North Adams. He was born and bred in North Adams. There's a whole story to be told about him. We could have another session just on him. But lest you think it's all men, here's the famous Gertrude Bell with the future King Faisal on her left. This is around the turn of the century, quite a bit later. This is what a tell looks like, an old city. In the old world, you built out of mud brick, and when your house collapsed, you just left the rubble and you rebuilt. So cities grew like mountains, artificial mountains on the plain. And at the very top of every Mesopotamian city was the Temple Mound and the ziggurat rising like a mountain above it. Mesopotamia, now Iraq, is otherwise a quite flat place. This is a Haines photograph. It's stamped from Cornell, where much of his collection is. When these early explorers went to the Near East, their context, as I said, was the classics and the Bible, probably like some of ours. And so they were trying to make sense of what they were finding. They could begin to read some of what they were reading in the cuneiform, and they were trying to make sense of it based on what they knew from the Bible. So you probably know this Bruegel painting. It's the Tower of Babel. So they'd think, okay, I know the Tower of Babel from the Bible. That's what a ziggurat is. So they could make sense of some of it, but the only history they knew is what they read in the Bible. So as they were digging, they were opening up sort of tunnels and caverns into the palaces, which were now at this time underground. Haines was not on the scene yet, so all the recording was done by watercolor. And these are two giant lamassu guarding the palace, these winged lion creatures. And on the left, you can see the Apkallu, the guardian figures that we have over at WCMA. See the winged figure? This is a gesture of greeting and holding flowers. One of Michael's pieces has holding flowers, like the top left. And then you see underneath that a bird-headed figure, and then underneath a human-headed figure, like what we have. So here they are, just being dug up. And then in the back, you can see another figure that they're uncovering. Imagine what that would be like. And I think this is effective because you see the exhausted workers. Dwight Marsh's wife actually died in Baghdad. And there's a heart-rending description written in his class book. She died when it was 114 degrees. And there she was, not in comfortable clothing like what we have. Again, I think the story of the Missionary Wives is another really interesting tale to be told. So here are guardian lions, also just being excavated. And then here, more lamassu, and then a griffin figure. And you can see the inscription. So this is all at Kalhu, Nimrud, with the standard inscription going across. These are the Williams figures. The pine cone, it's still debated, but I'll tell you what we know about these. They're called up Kalu, that they're modeled on, they come from a tradition of ancient sages, ancient wise men. They're wise, they can protect you from malevolent spirits, and they were all around the palace, guarding especially entryways, hallways, and corners. Sometimes they have wings, sometimes they don't. It's not completely understood why. It may have been a matter of space. But generally they're winged, which shows you that they're deities. We don't really know why they're bird-headed. There's some speculation about that. But originally, all the Apkallu, these sage creatures, they were all fish because the world started in the sea, and so the greatest, most ancient wisdom came from the sea. I don't have a picture of a fish Apkallu. But you can see how they're gendered. They're all gendered as male, and they're dressed like Assyrian males should be. But also designating them as gods are their horned headdresses. You see the scooping upward horns on the left-hand figure. I'm showing you a lot of these because they were sort of spread like potato chips around New England by missionaries who also went in search of them. This is at Amherst. This is also Amherst. This used to be Virginia Theological Seminary, but it was sold at Christie's for $31 million. It's now in private hands. You can see it's in 3 pieces. They were often broken up to make shipping more easier. And that is the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. This is the same kind of figure, but it's buried under the ground, another way of keeping a building safe. I'm way over time. Let's go fast. This is Hammurabi, famous king of justice, chatting. You can't tell which one is the god and which is the king because they're the same size. It's very daring. The god is on the right, the king is on the left. And this is a law code, a much more ancient law code, but copied at the time of Hammurabi, and you can see the nice cuneiform writing. And finally, I think I should stop here to leave time for others. There were gods, but there were also goddesses, but don't fool yourself that it was an egalitarian society. It wasn't. But this goddess here, Ishtar, was the goddess of love and war. And you can see how she's always shown with these spikes coming out of her shoulders. They're her weapons. And here she is greeting Shamash, the sun god, who's just stepping over the mountains. He's the god of justice. And so it's dawn, and she's greeting him at dawn. But I think I'm going to flip through quickly, very quickly, because I don't want you, more cuneiform, I just want you to see the picture. Ancient scholars are often accused of forgetting about the ancient world and the concerns of modern people, of keeping their eyes trained on the past and not on the present. But colleagues in Assyriology and other fields are working very closely with Iraqis to preserve their collections. And colleagues of mine just got back from Iraq and sent me this beautiful photograph. That is a reed hut. This is in the marshes. Saddam Hussein tried to drain them, tried to destroy the culture, but here it is, still vibrant, and a lovely mother and daughter living in there. You can see the reed building. And then here are Williams students, bringing us back to where we are now, looking with a group, it's called LIFT, from underserved youth in the area, and our students are sort of chatting with the local high schoolers. And this is the Yale Babylonian collection. I think that's a good place to stop. This art, ancient art, is inspiring to all of us, I think, because it's so removed but so present. This is a modern statue of the goddess Ishtar. She's lost her head, being held by a graduate student, and this is the work of a photographer, Regina Deloise. And that's a weight, a lamb weight in the Babylonian collection also. So let's stop there. I don't want to use up everyone's time. It's much too much. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm an anthropologist, and I think about how people live with art, how they give life to art, how they shape their lives through art. And I'm taking you back to a moment when I was an undergrad studying art history. On February 15th, 1991, David Levine published a cartoon in the New York Times, which he called The Descent of Man. Using a Darwinian schema, it suggests that humans have been devolving since Charlton Heston, back through the primates and reptiles to the lowest life form, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. I was an art history major in college, as I said then, and I had been participating in protests against the 1991 invasion of Iraq since its start a month earlier. I wore black every day to remind myself that people were dying because on the news, all we heard about were the eerily beautiful bombs, as one newscaster put it. I think it was Tom Brokaw. 2 days before Levine's cartoon appeared, the American bombing of a shelter in Baghdad had led to the incineration of 408 civilians. Horrified by the slaughter, I was chagrined to discover how many of my peers rationalized it on the grounds that contemporary Iraqis had, as they said, offered nothing important to humanity. Some fellow art history students added that while Iraq was the cradle of civilization, it clearly was no longer relevant, as evidenced by the lack of courses on our campus about any contemporary Iraqi or Arab or even Middle Eastern art. We like to think of art as a cultural bridge, uniting humanity. But Levine's cartoon and my classmates' responses revealed to me that invoking art can classify peoples and rank them. Staring at the cartoon, I realized for the first time in my life how deeply my life had been shaped by aesthetic profiling. So, aesthetic profiling consists of describing and assessing people's treatment of art for the purpose of predicting their behavior in other areas of cultural and political life. And it starts from the presumption that art is a universal category that all humans have the capacity to make, recognize, and cherish in the same way. it easily becomes grounds for advocating oppression against those who do not meet a desired profile. And I call that art fair, a campaign to control the lives of others due to and through their compliance or non-compliance with art conventions. What I suggest with my focus on art fair is that among the techniques of warfare are not only destruction of art and culture, but also the production of art and culture and concern for them. So let me explain what I mean with an example from Napoleon Bonaparte and his 1796 Italian campaign. Upon seizing Rome, Napoleon systematically stripped Roman nobles' homes of statuary, paintings, and relics, and he put that collection in carts, and that is what constitutes the core of today's Louvre Museum. Napoleon was actually the first conqueror to legalize looting by forcing the vanquished to sign contracts, surrendering their work. Under banners with slogans like, "The arts seek the land where laurels grow," he paraded the material through Paris in 250 carts in what he called a festival of liberty. What? Yeah, in 1798, which was to coincide with the anniversary of the fall of Robespierre, making the objects signify a triumph over terrorism, as he called it. So there's a great plate, made concurrent but reproduced in art form, an art journal in 1989 by Patricia Mainardi. So in response to international outrage at the time, at Napoleon's actions, 37 French artists avowed that, quote, "The Romans were lazy, superstitious, barbarians, who neither respected nor deserved their treasures. They thought those statues were for worshiping." Notably, Roman voices were excluded from these French artists' consideration of negotiations over ownership on the grounds that their treatment of art evinced their backwardness and hence ineligibility to debate politics and property. Bless you. Art historian Patricia Mainardi calls this the double authority of art. Beyond symbolizing claims to political superiority when wrested as booty, it can actualize them by bringing about new cultural configurations that in turn support claims to political and cultural dominance. Okay, yeah. So once great works of Roman pedigree were installed in the newly opened Louvre, Rome ceased to be the center of art and was relegated to being the cradle of art. Paris became the city of light, the obligatory training grounds for generations of artists until World War II. These were returned to, they're now at the Vatican. They were returned after 1816 when Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. So now we have the Louvre, right? What were some of the practical consequences of art fair for the Mesopotamian lands and for the people, my classmates, reduced to the cradle of civilization? First, Iraq had hosted free public art education, actually free publication, free college, right, and a flourishing art market. Now, after the 1991 siege, war and siege, practically a whole generation of highly skilled graduates discovered that painting copies could be more lucrative than developing a personal style or even pursuing a career in computer science. Working through display halls, artists would receive pages from pocket-sized catalogs produced by Parisian publishing houses and were told to execute copies in a specified format according to the dealer's sales expectations. They each worked for 24 hours a day, according to one interviewee, so they could produce 50 or 60 pictures a month. Although conceivably any style could be copied, approximately 3/4 of the copies that were made in the 1990s from Iraq and sold were of Orientalist art. And that's what visiting diplomats wanted to see. And another interviewee explained in 2001 in Beirut, where he had come to sell these very cheap oil paintings to me, that this is what could sell. This is how people could live in Iraq under siege, under the trade embargo. And here's another picture. So this is what you could get. These are Iraqi-made. They were on sale in Lebanon in the early 2000s, too. Here's another even more troubling outcome of art fair. In the first weeks after Baghdad's fall in April 2003, this time, more English language media reports dealt with one horrifying loss for which no one could be found directly responsible than with the preceding smart bombing that deliberately did target innocent lives in Iraqi hospitals, universities, bridges, shelters, and civil infrastructure generally. That loss was the mysterious disappearance of the Iraq National Museum collection. As many as 170,000 objects were reported vanished. With detailed descriptions of the emptied museum reaching Anglophone audiences by April 11th, 2003, officials at U.S. Military Central Command found they had to address what an uncharacteristically bewildered Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, ruefully called, quote, suddenly the biggest problem in the world, end quote. Responding to a journalist's fear, I should have given you a new slide, sorry. Responding to a journalist's fear at a press conference that the United States was culpable of failing to prepare for proper military occupation and the resulting anarchy in Baghdad might wash away the Iraqi goodwill the United States had built, Rumsfeld first insisted that images of what the journalists called widespread looting represented, quote, liberated Iraqis celebrating their newfound freedom, end quote. So what Napoleon had treated as an exercise in liberating, Rumsfeld glorified as a sign of Iraqis enjoying liberation. And there's some more. I actually read, there were about 2,850 articles about this. I read 10% of them and analyzed the press and would love to talk about that, but anyway. So, scores of news outlets would quote the Secretary of State's assertion, freedom's untidy and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. But when pressed to comment on military management, Rumsfeld explained that the looting was not so widespread. His proof? Iraq was really not that rich culturally. Some of you might remember hearing this. The images you are seeing on television, he was referring to an image from the looting, you are seeing over and over and over. It's the same picture of the same person walking out of some building with a vase. You see it 20 times. You think, my goodness, were there that many vases? Audience laughter. This is from a CENTCOM transcript. Is it possible there were that many vases in the whole country? It is a fundamental misunderstanding to see those images over and over and over again of some boy walking out with a vase and say, oh my goodness, you didn't have a plan. So Rumsfeld reduced the systematic dismantling of Iraq's governmental and social institutions to a single luxury item whisked off by a lone Iraqi boy. Turning the accusation of lack of planning on its head, Rumsfeld used the fact of the news clip's repetition as proof that Iraqi society lacked an entrenched civilization warranting a proper military occupation. The vase remark enjoyed even more replay in the US media than had the actual clip. And just as the Secretary of Defense metonymically substituted the image of the vase for all social disorder in Iraq, the Anglophone press quickly focused its concern for armed and civilian reappropriation of public and private assets in Iraq to images of the Iraq National Museum. The fate of the museum's collection was soon at the forefront of the discussion of efforts to instill order in Iraq as a first step towards determining its political future. Enter art fair. So to recap, the results of Napoleon's art fair were decisive for art production and devastating for Italian careers and treasuries. No subsequent Italian art movement ever attained the stature of post-Napoleonic French art. Aesthetic profiling is self-fulfilling. In August 2015, Rojin Sahakian announced the closure of Sada, an arts facility center she founded in 2010 in Baghdad to provide infrastructure for art production. Before the US-led siege and invasion of Iraq of 1991, Iraq had one of the best art education systems in the world. Rumsfeld's joke about the relative rarity of Iraqi vases haunts the Iraqi art world and the world that believes in art.
Well, I can't believe I have to follow that. Well, I'm really grateful to be here. I want to thank everyone at WCMA, and Nina, thanks for putting this together. Nina actually wrote a prompt for me to respond to, which was about the way in which the ancient could be seen as a lens through which to look at the present and to wield it as something that is contemporary. And so there's nothing more contemporary than a commodity. And this is kind of the trigger of a lot of my work, and I can't really get into the depth of this story right now because I have to limit this to around 5 minutes. But this is a moment that changed my life in 2004. I was living in Brooklyn, and I went to a grocery store called Sahadi Importing Company, which is a grocery that my grandparents had gone to and frequented ever since they arrived in New York when they fled Baghdad in 1947. And my mother had always mourned the last jar of my grandfather's handmade date syrup after he passed away in 1975, and had to go and buy other brands, including those from Israel, which she resented because they always filtered the date syrup so much that they made it lighter, and it was too much like a honey. So I saw this can of date syrup, and it had Arabic on it, and it had these beautiful swaying palm trees on it, and it said product of Lebanon. And so I brought it to the cash register, and Charlie Sahadi said, "Your mother's going to love this. It's from Baghdad." And so I looked again at the label to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, and he explained to me that the date syrup is in fact processed in the Iraqi capital, driven over to the border into Syria, where it gets put into unmarked tin plate steel cans, and then driven over the border into Lebanon, where it then gets labeled and is sold to the rest of the world. And this was one of the ways in which Iraqi companies had circumvented the UN sanctions since 1990. And this was 2004, more than 1 year after the sanctions had been dropped. And he said that importing anything that said product of Iraq would be bad business. I thought it would be good art. And so I proceeded to reopen my grandfather's import-export company, and another project that I can't talk about now involved importing dates for the first time to the US in over 40 years. And to make a long story short, my store basically was empty for 3 months, which left a lot of downtime. But it also, that empty store made me think about the empty museum. These are images of the Iraq Museum after the looting in April of 2003. And so I started to look at all these things that surrounded me, like these date syrup cans that couldn't tell me where they were from, that had to repress their provenance. And it made me think of the antiquities that were valuable because of their provenance. And so I started to think about these antiquities coming back as not as a reconstruction, but as a reappearance, as a ghost that could haunt us. And so I began a project called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, which is actually the translation of Ajibor Shapu, the main avenue that ran through the Ishtar Gate. So it's like the coolest name of a street that I've ever heard. And so the reconstructions and life size of these antiquities that are still listed as missing, stolen, destroyed, or unknown in terms of their status now wear the kind of skin of this of a kind of veiled provenance. So it's a project that really is about the ancient, but seen through a lens of the immigrant community, the diasporic community, the refugee community that still looks to keep a lot of those traditions most of which start with cooking alive. This project has grown in scale, unfortunately, since I began it in 2006. So it's moved beyond focusing on the National Museum of Iraq to focusing on the archaeological sites that were devastated in the wake of the Iraq War. So sites like Nineveh and Nimrud, which were destroyed in 2015 by groups like ISIS. So this is the floor plan of the Northwest Palace of Nimrud. And so my team of assistants and I build it room by room, depending on where it is that we have an opportunity to show. The first place that we showed it was room N, and it was shown at Art Basel Unlimited, because I only agreed to do it with my German gallery if I was going to have an opportunity to subvert the art market. Because I, as a site-specific artist, in making these objects, I realize that I'm making them oftentimes within the context of a kind of gallery system, and I'm making things that exist within a kind of contemporary art market. But it was the existence of an antiquities market that allowed for these museums and these sites to be looted. And in the case of ISIS, there should be no confusion that what it is that they destroyed was the stuff that was too big to sell. And what it was that they could loot, they sold on the black market, and that liquidation of that antiquity, of those antiquities into finance is what helped to kind of fund their war machine. These are pictures of the sketches, I guess, that Layard's team made to kind of imagine what this looked like in antiquity. And then these are the cans filled with the explosives that were lined up before ISIS destroyed it in 2015. But it was important for me to point to the fact that this is a story about displacement and destruction that does not begin and end with ISIS in 2015, and it actually begins, at least in the most recent chapter, I would say, in the 1840s when Austin Henry Layard and the protagonists or antagonists, depending on your politics, descended on that site to displace those reliefs and to bring them into Western collections. So my team and I decided to focus on room N because that was all the space that Art Basel was willing to give us. And so we made room N. And the way that we researched it is we looked at the cuneiform database library, which is at UCLA. You click on one of those letters, and then you learn about where all those artifacts are, where all those reliefs are. And so anything that is colored purple here, we made because they were in Nimrud and destroyed by ISIS. All these other places, all these other pieces that are not colored purple, which is kind of the majority, were all taken to Western collections. And the desire was to create a situation where the viewer was going to be put into the position of an Iraqi looking at that space the day before ISIS destroyed it. So to look at that room with its removals visible. So this is an example, and this follows very closely some of the archaeological theories about what they think the color schemes were. And I have another theory about what that pine cone is that I'll talk about maybe in the discussion part of the panel. And here you see the gaps that are left open. And then in this case, you can see the decapitation of one of the Apkallu figures. As was mentioned before, some of these pieces that when they were sent to the West were broken up to save on shipping, and in some cases, those Western collectors did not want to pay for the shipment of an entire panel. And so the excavators came up with a wonderful technique where they could simply slice off a piece of the gypsum. And so a museum like the British Museum could have a piece that was the most kind of palatable for their audience, which was the head. And this rubs up against, some of the quotes that are paired with this work where people like Laurie Henant talk about how the beheadings of the Lamassu were done very much like the beheadings of the Palmyrene people alongside the ruins of Palmyra, or the Assyrian Christians alongside Nimrud or Nineveh when ISIS destroyed them. This is an installation that I currently have now at the Oriental Institute in Chicago for its centennial. They actually have one of the pieces from Room G, and so we've made this very uncomfortable reunion and have allowed this work to be temporarily unbeheaded and suturing it together. This is the rest of Room G, which opened up simultaneously in Malmö, Sweden. I have a solo show in Malmö, Sweden now, where this entire banquet hall or banquet courtyard that existed in Nimrud has been reconstructed. And Malmö is one of those cities that the right-wing pundits around the world have used as an example of just how bad immigration is for white people. And so it has been derided in the press by people like our own president, by Geert Wilders in Scandinavia and elsewhere. And they have a population in Malmö of 12,000 Iraqi refugees. And the most incredible thing that has happened to me in this work has been the opening that happened there. And here you just get an idea of how much was removed by the West in that one banquet hall. You see one side has a good number of them there. There are some beheadings, but then an entire wall where you see the removals that are denoted by the blank spaces and the accession cards. And this is that quote from Laurie Hinant: "They dismantled the winged bulls, known as Lamassu, as purposefully as any decapitation they carried out on Mosul or the Syrian city of Raqqa." And these are all people who are responding to that site. Many of the quotes come from Iraqis who actually lived there. The incredible thing that happened was that at the opening, the Iraqi Cultural Association decided that they were going to host the opening. And so this was something the Swedes were not prepared for. And this is Lina al-Nahar, who is the leader of the Iraqi Cultural Association in Malmö. She's also a politician. She's in the left-wing Socialist Party in Sweden. This is her making the opening speech. Little did I know there were going to also be musicians. This is the crowd that is gathered, and so it really became a banquet hall space again. And all of a sudden, these musicians arrived. And what they're wearing on their head is Queen Puabi's headdress. So all of a sudden, these musicians were doing exactly what it felt like I wanted to do, which was to smash those vitrines and to use those artifacts the way that they were supposed to be used by the people who lived alongside them. And so they performed, and these reconstructed or reappeared reliefs will never be the same as they received all of this Iraqi joy. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the panelists. This is like the dream team panel right here, and so representing so many different backgrounds and disciplines and so on and so forth. And my remarks are going to be very brief, and I would like to start with some questions. But I'm a historian of the modern Middle East, but I've written about the history of archaeology and the politics of archaeology. And I was thinking about these objects that are in here in Wikma, the Neo-Assyrian reliefs, because at the time, what Layard and the 19th century, what they were doing, what they thought these objects would do, is that they thought that this was a scientific moment, that they had found evidence of the Bible, and they had found evidence of the truth, so to speak, and so they wanted, in the name of science, to bring these objects over to show it so that they can prove their religious point. And then the second, I think they were supposed to have an emotional appeal, that these are, amazing pieces sort of in terms of their size, but I think they were also supposed to have an emotional impact, that these works of art were maybe not necessarily seen as beautiful. They did not stand up favorably compared to Greek art that was seen as sort of refined and civilized in culture, where this was seen as more sort of grotesque and sort of belonging to an earlier part of sort of artistic evolution. So emotion in terms of awe, but also emotion in terms of sort of not so refined. And then the third thing is the political aspect of it, that bringing this back, required logistics and money and funding and so on and so forth, that I think was also supposed to represent, your position, your political, economic position, to show that you are a metropole, you are the powerful, you can put on display, show the reliefs of empire throughout, so that when you go to the British Museum, there's nothing British in it per se, it's just other things from elsewhere. And so that's also what these objects were supposed to be doing. And then finally, this pedagogical, what are they supposed to teach us, these ancient objects? What are they supposed to teach you, the viewer, and for society? And are they similar to what they were sort of supposed to do in the original aspect? And one thing that I've been sort of thinking about in the 19th century, when these archaeologists were going, such as Layard, who may have just been sort of adventurers and just sort of were going there because they didn't want to be working their accounting firm of the father in London, which was, in his case, was the what he would have been doing, is that these objects were supposed to, how they were supposed to sort of build upon a new narrative. And this moment is that when they were in the land of the Bible, and they were so aware that they were in the cradle of civilization, that they were in the beginning of time, and they were also, as they were looking at these sort of fallen empires, they were also thinking about the end of time. So it's sort of they're in the cradle, in the beginning of time, but also they're thinking sort of in apocalyptic terms, in the destruction of time, so the beginning and the end of time. So these objects, therefore, are sort of contradictory in that sense, and they probably send very mixed messages to people who are viewing them, and that was their context. So I'd like to then bring it to our context here today. And Lisa read the very interesting letter from the missionary, the Williams graduate of 1842. And he talked, so the prompt that you got, Michael, about sort of how does the past represent the present, but maybe I should just sort of phrase it in the way he phrased it, sort of, he talked that these relics of the past are supposed to teach us to think wisely of the times. And I want to maybe start with that sort of, his question, do the relics of the past, do they make us think wisely of the time? And what is this wisdom of the present time that these ancient relics are supposed to bring to us?
I could start from the point of view of the ancient world. In the ancient world, they were obsessed with the past. If you built anything, if you renovated your palace, or if you certainly renovated a temple, you had to dig up the old foundation deposit, which was a piece of writing that the founder of that structure would leave in it, detailing the instructions that had come from the god to construct it, and you would have to trace out the old foundations, and then when you yourself rebuilt it, you would make a statement of your own, a foundation deposit, in clay or metal, and bury it, saying, I did this and I have done it completely according to the foundation, as it was before, because the past was so important. I showed you very, very briefly the image of Hammurabi on his stela. And then after that was a cuneiform document copied in his time, but it was a law code. Hammurabi's famous for his law code, and there it was on the stela. But his scribes were copying law codes from 1,000 years earlier, because they had such a reverence for the past. If you wanted to do anything, it had to be authorized by the past. And then one more remark to make is the idea of the destruction of the past and collecting booty. That was very much part of what was done in the ancient world. In Assyria, the Assyrian Empire was the first world empire, and the royal inscriptions that come out of battle accounts always have accounts of the booty that was taken, claimed, brought to the palaces, put into the royal collections, and put into the temples as offerings to the gods. So it seems that we're in a sort of unbreakable human cycle. But we're having this conversation today, so that's good.
Well, in terms of what they teach us about the pastor today, what was the question?
So his quote was, he was hoping that these relics of the past would encourage us to think wisely of the times, so the present time.
At the present time. Well, I don't know that. I don't know that that's happened really. I mean, I think that there's a degree of interest that I have in what happened in the aftermath of the looting. You read my favorite quote by Satan's favorite poet, Donald Rumsfeld, and it was very easy to dismiss it. And I often talk about how the looting of the Iraq Museum was the first moment of pathos that had opened up in the war. Because it didn't matter if you were for the war or against the war, there was an agreement that this was catastrophic. And that museum, held some of the early examples of writing, early examples of urban planning. It was like a primal scene in human history. So that was very useful, that it wasn't just confined as a localized Iraqi loss. It was a loss for all of humanity. But when the outrage around lost objects did not turn into an outrage about lost lives, I found that infuriating. And so you mentioned the Virginia Theological Seminary sale, which I found to be so violent, so insulting, and was taking advantage of the fact that the value of that relief had risen so extremely high because of ISIS's targeting of these objects to destroy. And I think that one really needs to look beyond the way in which we're led to believe that these are destroyed because they're un-Islamic, and to kind of understand that these are targeted largely because the West valorizes or attaches a lot of value to these objects. And so it is because of what happens in the 1840s, that creates situations in 2015 of these iconoclasms and these state-sponsored destruction of heritage. It's not an apology for it, and it's not excusing it. But I think that we would be really, really naive, to not look deeper at the reason why that happens. And so when I'm thinking about that, I don't think that we're really kind of understanding our own times through these objects. But I am also interested in who we are as humans and our creatureliness, which makes us imperfect, and the fact that our grief sometimes goes into places that are indirect. So sometimes going into a votive statue from Mesopotamia and letting it be a votive for our grief is maybe understandable from a psychological point of view, but I'm not so sure that that's where it should end.
I guess what's interesting to me about objects is how they exist in multiple times. And it seems that the Reverend's quote suggests that it's a relic that would have been frozen in the past had it not been dug up, brought, and then placed in a present for other people to view the past and move themselves forward. Which is, by the way, one of the interesting reasons that Orientalist art became such a big topic in the 1990s in Beirut, as far as, at least from my having interviewed people, they liked to see what they saw as customers, liked to see, who were usually returning migrants to Lebanon after having been away during the Civil War, liked to see their ancestors and put pictures of their ancestors around them on the living room, dining room wall so they could move themselves forward from that. But this conceit forgets that objects remain alive, have life through how people interact with them, and that the missionaries, whatever, dug up these things, but they were part of ongoing lives in Iraq at that time. And when the emptying of the National Museum of Iraq was mourned as a loss for humanity, it was also not mourned as a loss for contemporary Iraqis who were making their lives, right, in many ways around that. And I think that if we think wisely, then we also, on the objects, then it requires us thinking about how much we want to instantiate separate timelines and separations of past, and so we know that we all have to march one way to the future, and I think that is the really dangerous thing, and not recognizing the human effort and saying that we're just responding to objects that are making us, think a certain way, rather than we're using objects to disallow other people to think and live the way they would. We could learn from them.
Michael, if I may ask you, so going with this theme of creation and destruction, so as an artist you're creating new objects, giving old objects new life in some ways, and maybe similar to the new Acropolis Museum in Athens that has these sort of very specific missing pieces in their art that are supposed to have a very maybe specific political and pedagogical role. So could you talk a little bit more about your creation coming out of this destruction, and then also a little bit about your family's background, whose heritage has been essentially destroyed or wiped out in Iraq, and how that influences your creation.
Well, yeah, let's start, I guess, with the last question, because I brought it up earlier in one of the class visits. But the home that I grew up in was, I talk about my grandparents now, my grandmother and my grandfather from Baghdad, as being like the first installation artists that I ever met, because I grew up in their house on Long Island, and what was on the floor was from Iraq, what was on the walls was from Iraq, what was coming out of the stereo was from Iraq, and what was coming out of the kitchen was definitely from Iraq. And and being able to immerse us, or them wanting to immerse their children and then us as grandchildren in this place that they left with a lot of sadness. And I think also confusion, because they were very proud to be from Baghdad and they considered themselves Arab Jews. That left a kind of, a bittersweet, feeling about what it was that they had left behind, but also they wanted to transmit that place to future generations of their family. And I'm very grateful for that, because I think that one goes through those traumas that you can also go the other way, which is to forget it, and I felt like it was very normal for me, and growing up around all that culture was suddenly threatened by, the green tinted CNN images that I saw at age 16 of Iraq being presented to me for the first time in real time, but these were not the stories my grandparents told me about Baghdad. These were buildings being blown up, and I was never going to be able to visit them. So the place my grandparents fled to was destroying the place they fled from, and that was a split, that was created for me. And I've always thought about, from that moment on, I guess, knowing that I was going to art school the next year, that I would probably be trying to piece together or preserve those stories for the rest of my life. And so, I think about mending these things, but always keeping the scar visible. And so when I'm making these things, I told you the story about why I started making them out of the detritus of Middle Eastern food packaging, but also the Arabic English newspapers that are given away for free in the supermarkets where I buy the food. And that's for newly arrived refugees, to help them settle. But I also realize that my studio looks a lot like my mother's pantry, and so while I'm using detritus and I'm making these things that have disappeared, I'm making them out of materials that sustain those communities and allow for them to survive, and there is joy in that packaging. There's color, and it allows for the color to return to those reliefs. We see them all as monochrome, the way that we see Greek sculptures and whatever, and it's a little bit like, blood returning to the veins or something. You get your color back or whatever. That's what I hope is happening in the work. But they're also made out of vulnerable materials, and it's guaranteed that, even though it's reappeared, one day it will disappear. But you're not a very good ghost unless you disappear at some point, Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So would it be okay with you if we open it up to the audience, if there are any questions from the audience? And I believe there's a microphone in the audience if people have any specific questions to the panelists about their stories, presentations, or about their art, or about...
I have a terribly basic
there's a question.
Oh, you could go.
I just wanted to ask, who were the primary looters? Who were the looters after the war?
I'll say quickly just about the 2003 National Museum. It's very interesting that war had more censorship than any previous experience. American journalists had to sign a 50-point contract to be allowed to be on the field. They had to embed, the only way they could report was to be embedded with American troops. And so this war is actually the war that we have the least information about. And all of the information about the National Museum came out after it had already been emptied. And the reports that I read they did two things. They tried to establish who had done the looting by looking at how the looting had happened. So the way you loot tells who you are. So if they saw smashed things, they said those were angry Shiite mobs. And if they saw cases that hadn't been smashed but had keys in them, that these were part of an international art market that was trying to get things. Clearly, these are circumstantial inferences made after the fact. And the other thing is the reporting contained first-hand description when that's impossible. They couldn't have done that. So they tried to reenact the scene of looting to give the reader the sense that they were there. And then the verbs are all either animalistic kind of verbs or weather, storms, angry waves, all of this. So non-human. It is really an interesting question, because in Napoleon's case, he said, I am looting, right? I get to do this, and then he made the people sign the contract, so it wasn't quite looting anymore. But it was very clear who took it and where it was going. In this case, as Michael's been saying, it wasn't clear who took it, but it's super clear where it was going. It shows up on the market. It was very clear that it was going there, and I think that's really the important thing, because otherwise we engage in this aesthetic profiling of deciding how people act on art.
I had the fortune to get to know Dr. Dani Georgioukhana, who was the former Director General of the Iraq Museum when it was looted, and he was also the president of the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. And he was really generous in opening up about, all the different stories about why it was looted, and it certainly has a lot to do with the things that you're saying in terms of it being a kind of failed attempt at profiling. Everyone had rumors that Uday Hussein was running a smuggling ring, and these were all operatives for Uday Hussein and his family. But what Dani told me were, he would show me an object and a photo, and he'd say, this piece has a really nice story. This piece was actually taken by a group of people who were in the museum at the time it was being looted, and they felt really bad that they couldn't protect anything. So they decided to take these objects home, and they put them in very, very protective storage. And then when there was amnesty for the looters, and also the American army was finally protecting the site, they brought them back. And they said, don't ask us for our names or anything. We wanted to protect these because we knew if we didn't take them, they were going to be sold. In other cases, Donnie just very matter-of-factly told me that, like, when you're facing the devastation of your country and you realize that everything is going to turn into a vacuum and you're thinking about keeping your family alive, he said a lot of these people that looted, it was a ticket out of the country for them. And so there was this liquidation of the past to save the present and preserve a future of some kind. You know, so those kinds of stories also surface, but they're anecdotal, you know, and they're not anything that's been proven in any way, shape, or form. But like, I've actually tried to mobilize that and to think of that impossible feeling, you know, of like one's cultural heritage being looted. And I was asked to do a project at MoMA once called the Artist's Experiment. And I'm like, all right, you want an experiment? Here's an experiment. You know, I want to do a survey of people coming through the door and say, you know, you're occupied tomorrow. What are you going to loot, you know, in your collection? They hated that project. You know, I never got a chance to do that one. But I'm interested in like what that looks like, you know, and putting oneself in, you know, the position, the unimaginable position.
So if I may add, so with chronology, we say, oh, the Iraq War started in 2003. But for Iraqis, the war didn't start in 2003. I mean, it goes back to 1980, and so Iraqis at that point had been
First World War.
Well, but continuous since 1980. That, you know, people have been living for 23 years with constant attacks, sanctions, assault, and so on and so forth. There was massive deprivation, no ways to earn any kind of sort of living. And this was maybe one, you know, response to that. Second of all, in the Intifada in 91, a lot of regional museums had been attacked. And this is why a number of archaeologists and scholars had gone to the Pentagon in in 2002, and Morgan Gibson went to the Pentagon, and these are the maps, these are the sites you have to protect, these are the museum, do this and exactly, and so on and so forth. And there was no protection of these sites. So this was known that this was happening. And thirdly, I think, yeah, what was looted and how was looted, it was clearly people who knew exactly which pieces to take. And then I think there was also this sort of chaos, but there were people who were knowledgeable looters. And the illicit market in antiquities is the second largest illicit market in the world after drugs. And I think it operates in entirely similar kinds of ways, except the buyers might be more sort of upper middle class than maybe in the illicit market for drugs. Yeah. So I think we need to explore that much more. But I think it's part of the chaos and the confusion, but also the suffering and the assault the Iraqis had been experiencing for such a long time, not just only from outside, but also within their own society. Sorry, there was a question.
I think you already alluded, or you alluded to this sense of futurity, and I was just wondering how how do I put this? How does this kind of contemporary notion or kind of emphasis on futurity or on looking forward complicate this idea of looking toward the past, or in terms of grappling with the past within this present moment?
That's a great question. You should answer it.
Yeah. I don't know. Wow. I think, you know, the history of these objects is so profound and so complex. As we were talking about looting just now, I was remembering one of the world's most famous objects, the Hammurabi Stila. You saw me flash by that very, very quickly. It was made by the most powerful man in the world at the time. It showed him standing in front of the god Shamash, who was the god of justice. He was receiving the tools of justice and the tools of rulership from that god. The stone that was carved on was not from Mesopotamia proper. It was taken from the mountain lands to the east, probably as booty, because the lowlanders were always at war with the mountain people. The word for enemy in both Akkadian and Sumerian comes from the sign for mountain. So this stone that was taken away from the mountains was made into the symbol of rulership and of Hammurabi as the king of justice, and inscribed with a legal code that either was or was not enforced, but it gave you the idea of the king as a just person. That was looted by the Elamites in the mountains and taken to Susa, where it lay for many, many, many years. And eventually it was found by the French and taken to the Louvre. So it's an object of triple looting. And so the reflection on the past that takes place there, and I also showed you that cuneiform tablet afterwards of Hammurabi's era reflecting on the past through a legal code from 500 or so years earlier. They're reflecting on the past too. They couldn't live without the past. For them, the word for future was, the future was before you. The past was behind you. That's how they envisioned it. I mean, yes, excuse me, the past was in front of you, and the future was behind you. It's actually a good way of thinking of it, because you don't know. You don't know the future. So I think it's a mystery is the answer. But I think we need to keep on reflecting on it, and we need to have conversations like this.
That's beautiful, because it also reminds me a little bit of Benjamin's Angel of History, you know, where it's constantly sort of like moving backwards from this rising pile of ruins. But I think that everything that you've pointed out is kind of, when you think about, you know, the future, and you think about how unstoppable this cycle is, you know, that, I mean, also, you mentioned it with the Elamites, and I'm thinking about also in the Iraq Museum, the collection that they had of artifacts from Nimrud were ivory, and all of that ivory was from Phoenicia. And the reason they had it was because they conquered Phoenicia, you know. And I think this came into sharp focus for me when I did a project in 2011 where I found Saddam Hussein's plates looted from his palaces and being sold on eBay, you know. And some of the plates that I acquired were actually King Faisal's plates, you know, King Faisal II, who was executed in 1958 during a coup, but Saddam had his plates in his cupboard. You know, so I think if I'm thinking about the future, I'm thinking about the fact that there's almost this unstoppable impulse to kind of repeat these acts in some way. But I also want to give a little space to just how cool a lot of this imagery is. And when I was, when my maquette for the fourth plinth was being presented in London, one of the people from the art press asked me, you know, how does it feel, you know, you're presenting alongside these other artists who are doing all these crazy, you know, abstract things, and you're doing something so classical, you know, which felt like an insult. But I was like, it's a human-headed, winged bull with lion's feet that's protecting a city, you know? And I was just thinking, what is crazier than that, you know? And these bird-headed people. And, you know, I do love very much the theories that get projected on Assyrian antiquities, like the Zechariah Sitchin kind of like crowd that believe that, you know, the Iraq wars were fought because Saddam Hussein had a Stargate underneath his palace in Iraq, you know, and that, you know, there's something about some of the sci-fi imagery that's in these artifacts that I think are just so unbelievably, you know, like they prefigure so much in terms of our imagination. So I don't know if that's useful, but I just kind of like, if I think that there can be something called Babylonian futurism, you know, like maybe there's something in there.
By the way, what's your theory about you said you had a theory about the cone?
I wanted to hear yours before, because it's not my theory, it's just there was a scoop that happened while my team and I were making Room Z. And that was, somebody had said that it is in fact not a pine cone, but it's an infantile date palm. So it's an offshoot And what's in the bags is date pollen. And this was the way in ancient Assyria they fertilized, because date palms grow male and female. So they would take the pollen from the male tree, put it in the bag, and take the infantile spat, and then go up into the tree, onto the fronds, and fertilize the female trees with the pollen, which, coming back to dates, was just such an incredible serendipity.
I'm sorry, I don't have an opinion about that. When you see the squiggly tree, I don't know if Michael has any. It's a very stylized tree.
The tree of life.
Yeah, the tree of life. People have always wondered what that is, and I heard a scoop at a conference last year that that's actually a sort of semi-aerial view of a whole grove of date palms. Because like aspen trees, they're interconnected. So if you see the squiggles going around the tree, those are just sort of an aerial view of the whole grove and how interconnected they are, which I found really lovely.
Beautiful.
That's Norma Franklin's theory.
That's like crop circles. Oh my God, there's so much to connect, you know?
But it's fun that we don't know.
Yeah, it's true. Somebody had, I thought I saw a hand go.
No, I was going to ask about your theory.
Oh, okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for presenting your work to us. I was just wondering what you all think the sort of ethics and utility are of continuing to own and display the Assyrian reliefs at WCMA today.
I think this is a fine time.
So $31 million, was that the price?
Yeah, the Virginia Theological Seminary said that it was to fund a scholarship. Yeah. Well, do you want to? When these conversations come up, you know, about what it means to maybe, if you want to use the word, decolonize a museum, or to address issues of accountability. I think that these are important issues, and that was part of the really wonderful dialogue that I've had with Lisa and the team here, because they're uncomfortable objects. In as much as they are, you know, teaching objects, because it is a teaching museum, they represent a whole lot of trauma in terms of how they got here and what has happened since. And I want to be guided by people to whom those objects belong in determining what the future should be. I would like for those people in Iraq to add their voices to a discussion about what restitution or repatriation might look like. It came up in one of the class visits today, and it's something that I think about every single day, really, which is the degree to which I think the end game of repatriation and restitution might be too easy on the West. It lets too much off the hook. And I believe that decolonization is a process. It's not a result. And I believe in unsettling. And I believe that the discomforts that come from a continuous and ongoing, forever conversation about these things is necessary. Because the traumas of displacements actually go from generation to generation to generation. And so I'm somebody that believes in keeping the traces of problems and failures alive. So I leave open the possibility that if something like repatriation is what is most desired, then that is what should happen. But I do believe that a wide-ranging cultural project of this conversation happening is even more important. And also to kind of recognize the fact that, you know, there's something that is basically good about us being curious about one another. So I'm not necessarily against an encyclopedic museum, you know, to be able to, I have 2 small children, and I like that they can go and learn things in a place, but if it's done consensually, I think that that's important, where it is about exchange as opposed to extraction. And there's a reason why encyclopedic museums emerge in the West, you know. It's a colonialist program. It's a project that comes from conquest. And I brought this up with the BBC around conversations around the Lamassu, when they were asking, you know, when I was talking about the Lamassu that I've made facing away from a museum, not towards a museum, and looking to return to Nineveh. And then I was asked, do I think that the pieces in the British Museum should go back? And I said, well, that's for the Iraqi people to decide. And so I said, you know, maybe they want an exchange. Maybe they want a piece of Stonehenge. And he was like, that's never going to happen. That'll never happen, you know. And but I think the audacity of saying something like that is part of the process, you know.
I have brought classes, like tomorrow my class is going to visit you, and for the last 16, 17 years, and the students here at Williams, their relationship with these objects and this question has changed dramatically. It's constantly changing. And I think you're right that it is a process and it's an ongoing conversation. And I know the Ministry of Antiquities in Iraq is aware of these objects, like they are of all these others. And so at what point will they make that claim, or will they want to initiate that conversation? And then, you know, we'll have to be ready for that conversation. Professor Hedrin, did you have you had your question?
Well, much of it was already answered.
Okay.
This doesn't work, you know.
It's really funny. I love how it's like
sorry.
I think it's
an
for the
object
video.
of sympathetic magic. It's like,
For posterity, I'm going to say this.
I think it's for the video.
I was struck by your comment about the looting of the Baghdad Museum as a moment of worldwide pathos, right? Because there's a evil twin of this idea, right? And that is that that these antiquities belong to the world, and they don't actually belong to the objects that come from Iraq don't belong to the Iraqi people. The objects that come from the ancient objects from Greece don't belong to the Greeks. You know, they belong to the world. And this is to me, a very pernicious idea. It's a very self-serving idea that's, you know, been articulated for the most part in the West by European and American museums and collections to justify, you know, their objects, and I mean their you know, their acquisitions and their I have a bad feeling that the Iraq War, and what happened in Iraq, has set back this conversation. That in some ways it makes the idea of restitution harder. I don't know if you want, if you have any further comments on this. I mean, this is it's a very uncomfortable relationship between an ethical claim, that is to say, we all have a stake in our history, right, and an art market. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I want to say, as somebody who kind of came to consciousness of, I mean, I was a student, I was studying art history when Iraq was invaded the first time by the US that I knew of. And then 2003, seeing just looked like, wow, America has to do it again. Like, you know, by then I was living in Lebanon. And I heard so many people saying, see, this is why the material should be kept in the British Museum, for example, that the Elgin marbles should not be returned, that this is why these stable places are better places. They make better homes for the art. And that's the kind of aesthetic profiling that I'm talking about, the description that freezes. So you think about how Britain becomes this stable place. When the British were actually asked as a parliament to consider acquiring, or paying for, actually. Sir Elgin, he wasn't a sir yet, but he'd already bought the stuff, looted it, kind of twisted arms to get it. And then he wanted payment, because he didn't want to keep it in his house anymore. He wanted money, he had debts, and he wanted Parliament to buy it, and he was trying to convince them. They were not convinced that these were very good pieces. They actually didn't think that this Greek art was the best stuff. And so it had to be a discussion, well, what will Britain get out of entering these things into the British Museum? And then around that, I mean, they finally decided that British art was in a very bad state, so pretty much anything it could get would be helpful, because British were nothing like the French. And this is in the early 1800s, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, there's so much that followed to push to build, to create that space, right? That was part of the continual colonial extraction in order to make a solid space where these objects could be kept. And you have to think of that as then the unmaking of other places. So any description of one place as like great for art is foundationally related to describing another place as not okay for art. Now, how does that happen? And when the Twin Towers that came down were bombed in 2001, there were artworks there by the very famous French sculptor Rodin. There was a collection of like 50 pieces there that were destroyed. And nobody was saying, oh, see, New York's a bad place for art. I was living in Beirut at that point, and I remember I was in a gym and watching the coverage and people saying, this can't be happening in our city because this is like Beirut. I'm like, what? What? Like, how did you get to think that New York is categorically not like that and other places just essentially are? Like, that's a real human tragedy, actually, and people need to be, I think, responsible, reflective on that.
So I think we're at time, but I would like to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for your excellent comments. Thank you so much.